Hi, my name's Rob Dinnis. I'm going to talk to you today about our recent work at Wogan Cavern. I and my colleagues have excavated at numerous caves across Britain, and by some distance this is the site that we're most excited about. So I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about it. Hopefully you'll get some idea of why we're so excited about this site. What I will do is, before I talk about Wogan Cavern and our work, I want to sort of outline a problem that we have, which is basically that Victorians were very good at emptying our archaeological caves around about 150 years ago, and as a result we really don't have the sites that we can use to apply modern methods to ask the questions that we want to ask now of the archaeology, and we think that Wogan Cavern might be an exception to that. So what I want to do is outline that problem, explain why we need a site that's really good, a new site, and then explain to you what we found at Wogan Cavern and why we think this might be the site of our dreams. Okay, caves. So caves are very good for certain types of archaeology for several reasons. First is, of course, they attract people and animals. So as an archaeologist, the things that you want to find, all of the rubbish that people leave behind, quite often you find that in caves. Also animals use caves, so they leave behind things like animal bones themselves. So what you have is you have an accumulation of material in caves, but then you have sort of, because caves are, the nature of caves in the landscape mean they're quite often protected from erosional forces taking place outside. So quite often you find material is protected in caves that isn't protected elsewhere. This example here is Fernambino Cave, so this is in North Wales. But this is, I use this as an example because this has material in it that predates the last glacial maximum, when all around this was ice sheets and ice mass, but there is a certain pocket of bones and stone tools that were protected within this cave because of the preservational nature of caves. So you have quite often a lot of time depth. You have a long period of time represented by material left in caves, and it can be protected for a long period of time. And this, of course, has been known for a long time. This is not a new observation. And so early antiquarians and people interested in the question of the antiquity of humankind, they were particularly interested in caves for certain periods. And as a result, you saw extensive excavation of caves in the 1800s and at the beginning of the 20th century as well. I've put here that this is not a uniquely British problem, but this is because we start out, we're on the fringes of the world for a lot of early prehistory, which is of course what caves can tell us about best. We're kind of at the fringes of the occupied world, so we don't have that many sites to begin with, or we didn't have that many sites to begin with. And what we had, we didn't have that much material in these sites. So the impact of people excavating out these caves was a lot more significant in Britain, I think. And people in Britain, these early excavators really did go to town on some of these sites. Here's an example. This is Robin Hood Cave at Creswell Crags. And you can see this enormous quantity of material that's spilling out of the cave. This is not anomalous. Many of our caves looked like this during their excavation. Huge quantities of material taken out at speed. And as a result, we just simply don't have the sites left. And as I've already just said there about this crucial period that caves can tell us about is early prehistory. And in particular, the last glacial cycle. This is a period that we do have sites that aren't in caves, but our most important sites tend to be in caves, or at least were in caves. And we have this period that across Europe now we have a really good idea of what's going on, but in Britain we have a very poor record because we just don't have any sites left for this period. So of course it was the Ice Age. Things look very different. We have animals like mammoths, woolly rhino, hyena cave lion, that kind of thing. And really we have this very crucial event that we now think probably took place around about 45,000 years ago, where Neanderthals were replaced by Homo sapiens, by people like us. Again, in Britain, we don't have a very good record of this at all, and we don't have sites that we can go back to and usefully ask more questions about this, and it's a real problem in British archaeology. And I wanted to sort of flesh that out to explain why it's a problem, but first to explain what you're looking, the images you're looking at there on the right. This is recent work that's been published over the last couple of years, apologies, from Bakokiro Cave in Bulgaria. Absolutely wonderful work that's been done because there are archaeological deposits, there's archaeology left in this cave, and this cave represents this period of the transition between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and it has loads of wonderful objects in it. It has stone tools, it has ornamental pieces, it has DNA surviving, it has human remains, but DNA surviving there as well, which is great. So this is an example of what can be done if we have a site, but of course in Britain, as I've said, we don't really have those sites. What we have are old collections, and what I wanted to do here is just explain to you some of the problems we have with our old collections. So the first bit is, first point here is, where do our bones and artifacts actually come from? So of course in a museum you might find some bones that are from a particular site. They might be marked as being from this site or from that site, but sometimes that's all we know. We don't know where in the site. We don't know where they were found relative to other bones in the site. And actually, sometimes we don't even know that they're from a particular site. Sometimes labels get mixed up, things get moved around, and we're not quite sure. But we certainly don't know with precision where things are from. The second point, the question here, how complete are the collections? So nowadays, when we collect material from a site, we collect every bit of bone, we collect every small bit of fragment of stone tool. But of course, that wasn't the case in the 1800s. Only the big bits were kept. In terms of the animal bones, of course, small fragments were often considered completely unimportant because we don't know what animal they're from. So it was only the big pieces, the diagnostic pieces that were collected. So quite often you don't have those things. Now, we now know that the smaller pieces are actually quite often the most informative pieces. For example, the tiny stone tools can actually tell us a lot more about the culture than the bigger ones. And in terms of environmental change that tracks with climate change, we now know that it's those small animals that respond to that change quicker. And therefore, those things that are missing from the collections that we have are actually the most important for answering the questions that we're interested in. Third question here, what's the collection's curatorial history? Things can get moved around, as I've said, but there are other things to take into account. So quite often treatments were made on bones in order to preserve them. It was considered the right thing to do, but these mean now that sometimes our scientific analyses can't be done on these old collections. Radiocarbon dating is a classic example where trying to radiocarbon date bones from an old collection is quite problematic. It's quite tricky because you don't know what preservatives have been applied to the bones and whether they are going to affect the result that you get from your analysis. Another point is that in the 1800s, of course, the questions that were being asked were very different from those that we're interested in now. We've moved on. So before, for example, people were wondering whether humans were around at the same time as extinct species of animal. What we're interested in now is that kind of higher resolution question. How many times were people here during the last ice age? How long did they stay? What periods were they absent and exactly when were those periods? So it's these higher resolution questions. Now the records that they kept at excavation, I mean, if they kept records at all, simply aren't good enough for us to even approach this sort of question. And lastly, can we use our new techniques? Of course, the things that we're doing now are very different from the techniques that were used in the 1800s. And can we use new techniques on old collections? In some cases, yes, we can, but in a lot of cases, no, we can't. The picture in the top left here is collecting a sample of sediment for DNA, because the DNA survives in the cave sediment. This is a very new technique, getting great results. You may have seen some of this in the papers to do with finding Neanderthals just in their DNA in caves in the sediments. Of course, we can't do this. We can't do this because if our sites have been completely dug out, then we don't have access to decent decent sequences of sediments to try and do this. We have a couple of sites in Britain that we can attempt this on, but really what we need is a new site with lots of archaeology that we can try these techniques. So there you go. There's the take-home message. We do need a new site. We have all of these really important research questions. Our understanding of early prehistory, particularly this last glacial period, is not very good in Britain compared to elsewhere, and really what we need is a new site in order to apply our new techniques to. Which brings me on to Wogan Cavern. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, that's where Pembroke is. So Wogan Cavern, of course, is beneath Pembroke Castle. I have my pointer here, hopefully you can see this. So it's behind this wall here, underneath the castle. And it really is an impressive cave. It's a very big cave. I'll come back to that a bit later on, but it's an impressive cave, and one about which we really didn't know very much beforehand. There was some previous work done on it, but really not very much can be said. So we think that there were mid-19th century excavations by Reverend Gilbert Smith. The reason for the question mark is there are some stone tools attributable to the cave in his collection in Tenby Museum. But he really, in his scrapbook, in his notes, he doesn't really talk about Wogan Cavern. He talks about the other sites that he excavated, the Caldy Island Caves, Hoyle's Mouth, but he doesn't really talk about Wogan Cavern. So there's a little bit of a question mark there. There are a little over 30 flints, I think, in total, marked as belonging to the cave. This is the only one which we can sort of put an age on. This is a Mesolithic point. So this is kind of probably around about 10,000 years old, maybe a touch older than that. It's not in the Ice Age, it's the period immediately after the Ice Age. So it's early prehistoric, it's obviously back before farming, but it's not quite back as far as the period that I've been stressing is so important for us. Another little hint here, Arthur Leach said much casual digging has been done and objects found by various people. Arthur Leach himself found some Roman pottery. So we have Mesolithic material, we have Roman pottery, we also have some bones and some shell from the site, but nothing really that is particularly helpful in understanding it. And of course, as is typical, no actual record of any of these excavations, exactly where they were in the cave, exactly what they dug. So what we did was we wanted to look at this site largely because the guy on the right there, that's John Bolton, he visited the site and he thought because of its size, and if you imagine it without the wall, how much daylight will have been in it will have been a very, very useful site to use in prehistory. I think he's absolutely right. Most of our sort of early prehistoric sites, not many of them are particularly big. A lot of them are quite small. They seem to have been the focus of a very short amount of, a very small amount of activity, perhaps a short amount of time. And in some cases, actually, probably people weren't even in the cave. It's just that stuff's fallen in and it's been protected. But John thought actually this is a site that looks like it might have been ideal for people to actually use more intensively, might have sort of even lived here. Certainly more activity in this kind of cave than you would imagine for most of our Paleolithic caves. So as a result of John pestering me, we did some visits down here and then we started excavations, very limited test excavations over the last 2 years. We were due to come down in 2020, but of course COVID intervened. And then we came down in 2021, a very, very small group of us, and we did a very, very small amount. We did a bit more in last summer, but really, so far we have only scratched the surface, so if you just keep that in mind with what I'm about to tell you. Okay, so the first thing we can say is that we have found evidence for previous excavation in the cave. This was something that we were expecting. On the left there, what you're looking at there is one of our trenches at the back of the cave, and that has basically shown that there is an archaeological layer that has been chased back, and actually in areas close to it there are pickaxe marks, but there's this kind of flowstone floor that's been clipped back and the archaeological artefacts seem to have been taken out. But they've not dug down, they seem to have just chased the artifacts back against the cave wall. And then elsewhere in the middle of the cave, we found a very typical, very characteristic spoil deposit. So this is absolutely classic for these sort of mid-19th century early excavations, where you have different types of earth from different geological deposits within the cave, all mixed up together. And then you have mixed age artifacts. We had some early prehistoric flints, but also what we had were these bits of pottery here. Some of this is Roman age. The bit at the bottom is medieval. And the smoking gun, of course, the clay pipe stems that the workmen used to deposit when they had a break. So a very typical spoil. So this shows that we've got previous excavation in the cave, but so far we've not really found hugely extensive excavation, so we don't really know where they were excavating. We know that they've targeted this area where they've just taken back this archaeological deposit, this archaeological layer, but we don't really know the full extent of it yet. We've got some nice evidence for historic age use of the cave. So we found some nice holes. We assume these are sort of stake holes, post holes. We think they may be medieval at the moment, that's our thinking, but they're certainly post-Roman and pre-Victorian. Here you've got one being excavated by Jude there, and then on the right that's a nice bit of antler with chop marks that was used, one would imagine, to pack down into the hole. We found that in the hole itself, along with a load of other debris. So we have historic age use of the cave. If it was medieval, it would be unsurprising, given that it's beneath the castle. But much of the cave, to our surprise, is actually untouched. And this really was surprising. On the left-hand side, this is another area of the cave. And this was our very first sort of scratch of the surface. And we took about 2-3 millimetres of tread off the top and discovered what you can see on the left. And what that is a very flat surface that's actually a flowstone layer. It's actually a calcium carbonate deposit. And this is intact. It's never been dug out, so it's not been touched by Victorians. And actually, it's probable that this flat, hard surface was useful for medieval period, during the medieval period. And that might be why those post holes are in it, because that's a very useful surface to make use of this enormous, big, helpful cave. And then on the right, you can see that's further towards the middle of the cave, and again, you can just see there, that's the stalagmite layer, this flowstone layer rather. So again, you have this floor surface that's not been dug out. So this is basically protecting everything that's underneath it, which of course is wonderful and very unusual. And then underneath that, so immediately underneath this sort of flowstone layer, is a Mesolithic layer. So this is the same as, we think, the same age as the stone tool that I showed you from the old collections in the museum. But we, of course, using our modern methods, we've got a lot more material than there is in the museum. We have, from this square alone, we have more than 300 little pieces of flint or stone tools. And this is, we think, an early Mesolithic layer, or at least it has early Mesolithic in it. So this is just after the end of the last ice age, when people were still hunting, gathering, before farming. But it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to find, this wonderful layer. And of course, it's been protected under this flowstone surface. And we have that in the centre of the cave as well. That's then dug out. After we dug that out, we then found underneath it we have ice age deposits. So this here, this light coloured thing, is the flowstone. And then the Mesolithic sat around about there. And then you can see underneath you have this deposit which has lots and lots of limestone blocks in it. That's basically back into the last ice age. And within this we found stuff. We found bone, a lot of it quite fragmentary, but of course we now have techniques available to us that weren't available previously, that we can actually say an awful lot about this fragmentary bone. So here's an example on the right here. You have two pieces of bone. The top one, this tiny bit of grotty bit of bone that was stuck to a rock, and using a technique called zooms that analyses the collagen left in the bone, we were able to say that that is a piece of mammoth bone. And then underneath that you have a piece of rib, and again, using the same technique, we were able to say that's a piece of reindeer. So we have horse, we have reindeer, we have mammoth, we have deer, we have sort of the classic last ice age animals. But the most exciting thing is that we also have evidence for people. We have only a few stone tools at the moment, but we've only dug a very small amount and we haven't gone down very far, so we don't quite know what's there to be found. But we have these stone tools, and this is incredibly unusual. To find a site, it's basically, we think, so far, that this is, all the stone tools are representing a visit by early Homo sapiens, one of the earliest groups of people like us to ever come to Britain. And yes, this is incredibly unusual to find this kind of archaeology. It's only a very, very small number of sites that have this archaeology, and of course they were excavated so long ago that we know nothing about the sites, and we have to guess about where the archaeology actually came from. So absolutely incredible. We have everything that we would want to have. We have an intact site, and we have early prehistoric material, multiple layers of archaeology, including that from the last ice age. So it's absolutely wonderful. So there you go. Wogan Cavern is already hugely significant. I would argue that it's the most significant site for the last glacial, the most significant cave for the last glacial cycle for many, many decades. I would argue at least 100 years. Because we've got these intact deposits, including ice age deposits, we've got this intact early prehistoric material that's not been messed around with, it's not been dug out by the Victorians. And of course it means that, as I said at the beginning, the modern techniques that we want to use, we can now use. At the bottom you can see this, the picture in the middle. That's one of the team going through all of the residues from the sieve to try and pick out all of those tiny bits of bone, those tiny rodent bones. And we found that there are huge amounts of microfauna in some of the archaeological layers. So basically we are able to say a great deal, or we will be able to say a great deal about the environment and the climate at the time of that. We of course we know that there's collagen in the bone, so we'll be able to do dating, that kind of thing. But of course, as you can see on the left, this is collecting sediment samples for this DNA analysis to try and find DNA of animals and maybe even humans in the sediments themselves. And of course this is a site that is perfect for the application of these kind of techniques. So we're already applying some of these. But the point is that we have barely scratched the surface. We've done 2 very short, very limited field seasons, and we have excavated. My calculations, making lots of guesses about the shape of the cave. I think we've probably dug about 1/1000th of the sediment there, so we really have barely scratched the surface, and we don't know what else is there. We don't know how deep the sediments are really, so it's certainly one for the future to look out for. So please do stay tuned. I expect you will be hearing more. We should be back next summer, all being well, and the summer after that as well. So yeah, please do stay tuned and look out for us. And thank you very much for listening. I thank you to all of those people listed there, and apologies for people that I've forgotten. But on the right, I want to just, there's a picture of 4 of us, that's me on the right, and then I want to just give a special thanks to the other 3. So next to me is John. That's John, who's the reason that we're there, because it was him who suggested looking at the site in the first place. Next to John is Jay. Jay is an expert on human anatomy and bones, and she's basically dig mum, so she looks after us all while we're down there. And then next to Jay, that's Jenny French up at Liverpool University, who's my second in command on the dig. So yes, thank you to everyone there. Thank you.